Okay, everybody, it's a little bit after 2 o'clock. Scott Sternberg here from Sternberg, Naccari White. My partner, Keith Naccari, is going to give a presentation about the SBA disaster loans, the basics of an SBA disaster loan. Before we talk about that, though, just want to thank you all for either being a friend or a client of our firm, and also being with us virtually as opposed to in person so that we can keep our social distance. Also, everyone is practicing excellent conference call etiquette by muting their lines. Thank you so much. I feel like we've really progressed as a society. I'm going to read this disclaimer for you because, we're not financial advisors, and it's incredibly important that you talk to a financial advisor or talk to an attorney before you take out any loans or make these decisions for yourself. A good financial advisor is something that everybody needs, and a good attorney is as well. And hopefully you'll think of us in the future, but if not, there's certainly plenty of great attorneys out there that are doing excellent work. So Keith, would you like to take it away?
Sure. Thank you, everybody, for attending and giving us your time. We're going to go through some basics of the disaster SBA loans. I know there's going to be a lot of questions about how these loans are going to interact with the CARES Act that will hopefully be passed tomorrow morning. We will be doing another seminar Monday afternoon, assuming that does pass tomorrow, to hopefully address those questions. This will be a basic overview on the SBA disaster loans. So when we talk about disaster loans through the Small Business Administration, there are three basic types. We have physical damage, economic injury, and home disaster loans. Home disaster loans are mostly going to be personal in nature and not involve the business. The physical damage and economic injury are going to be injuries that are sustained by your business. We are going to focus in particular on economic injury since that is what the COVID-19 virus is being considered. Right. So who qualifies for these loans? Basically, your small business must be in a declared disaster area, which in a very unique set of circumstances, the entire state of Louisiana, as well as most other states, are considered a disaster area. This is usually pushed down to one or two parishes. In this instance, it's the entire state. And then you have to have suffered a substantial economic injury to your business. The SBA defines a substantial economic injury as when the business can't meet its obligations to pay ordinary and necessary operating expenses. A little later in the presentation, we'll get into what ordinary and necessary operating expenses are, and we'll give you some examples of those as well. Okay, so economic injury disaster loans are available to small agricultural cooperatives, small aquacultural businesses, and most private and nonprofit organizations. The rates will vary whether you're for-profit or nonprofit, but nonprofits will be eligible. The business has to either be directly affected, offer service to business who are directly affected, or have some other indirect effect based on an effect on the industry that's being affected. In this case, most are going to have a fairly direct effect from the virus. Okay. So we do a four-part test when we're looking at qualification. Those tests are location, business activity, size, and making sure that the business is independently owned and operated. We'll go into each of those tests in a little more detail. Okay, Concerning the location, you must have a physical presence in a declared disaster area. As I said before, for COVID-19, the entire state of Louisiana is considered the disaster area. Your presence has to be tangible and significant. So if your business simply had a PO box in the state, that would not be sufficient enough to have a physical presence. But if you're actively in the state and actively participating and operating your business in the state, you'll have no problem. Okay, then we'll go into the business activity test. Your primary activity, the primary activity of the business has to be eligible to qualify for these loans. There are certain activities that are excluded. We'll go through those in detail a little later in the presentation, but an example of that are gambling institutions. The primary activity is going to be based on prior year's revenue. So in the case of a gambling cooperative, they'll look to see if 1/3 of the revenue is coming from that, and they'll look to average prior years in determining if the business activity is eligible. The activity that's generating the loss has to be eligible as well. So if you do have part of your activity that would be ineligible, that can't be where the loss is being generated from. Okay. Size. So we'll look at both the applicant with and without its affiliates, and they can't exceed the standard size for the industry. These loans will often be rejected for very large entities in a particular industry, because again, it's intended to assist small businesses. Okay. And the last prong is this independently owned and operated. The applicant has to have substantial risk and be free from significant control. So the substantial business risk means the principals or the owner of the business has to have something at stake, right? They have to have something that they could lose if the business fails. Free from significant control, we're looking to make sure that your business is not really under the control of another. So if you're a business that has a single client, they're going to effectively look at that single client to determine eligibility, because you're really under their control. So again, as we discussed, for qualifying entities, we can have for-profit, small businesses not otherwise ineligible. And same thing for nonprofit organizations that are not otherwise ineligible. A good example of an ineligible nonprofit organization is a religious organization. They will not be eligible for the small business disaster loans. Okay. So here goes into a lot greater detail on examples of ineligible entities. As we discussed, religious organizations, charitable organizations, consumer and marketing cooperatives, gambling concerns. So this is a business that over 1/3 of it is generated from gambling. Casinos or racetracks at any percentage. Concerns engaging in illegal activity. I know it would be a shocker, but you can't get an SBA loan if you're using it to sell heroin. So that one's fairly obvious. Lending or other investment concerns. You can't borrow the money to lend it out at a higher interest rate. Speculative activities. This would be borrowing the money to then invest in the stock market or some other speculative activity. Pawn shops, real estate developers, and this is developers in the sense of putting in streets, putting in sewage, electric, and subdividing lots. Multi-level sales distribution concerns. So here they're concerned about lending to pyramid schemes, and concerns where a principal is either incarcerated, on parole, or probation at the time of the loan. Okay. What can we cover with these economic injury disaster loans? This is again where we're going into the normal and necessary expenses for the operation of the business. Most common examples of this would be payroll, rent or a mortgage payment, utilities, extraordinary expenses that are directly resulting from the disaster. A good example would be if you're trying to pay to have your office sanitized. Fixed debt, which would go back to the mortgages or any accounts payable. It should be noted you can't speed up certain payments to have it covered by the loans. And there appear to be some interactions with the CARES Act for the top three: payroll, rent, and utilities. So it will be important to track those separately for the next few months. Okay. What can it not cover? Refinancing long-term debt. You can't use the lower interest rate if you own your business's building to refi it over the next 30 years. Paying down or paying off loans as a general rule. Payment of any part or part of any federal debt, except for IRS obligations. This can be done because IRS obligations will generally have to be satisfied before the loan will be issued. And if a federal debt is delinquent, the SBA has to have written documentation from the appropriate agency explaining how the delinquency will be cured. This is again how you would end up being allowed to pay an IRS obligation. Okay. General terms. They're going to be based on the applicant's financial position. So these are credit-worthy loans. And it's going to be based on the SBA's credit scheme. The loans can be up to $2 million, less any business interruption insurance and other recoveries received. We will actually be having another presentation next week concerning business interruption insurance because it is an interesting topic with the COVID-19 virus. The terms of these loans can be up to 30 years, depending on what the SBA determines is necessary to make repayment palatable. Okay. Some additional requirements. Again, these are credit-driven loans. Applicants must have a good credit history. And you have to be able to show your ability to repay these loans. While the CARES Act is having some provisions for certain percentages of these loans to be forgiven, at the time of application, you do have to show the ability to repay. They're going to look at personal financial statements. They're going to look at tax returns for business and personal. They'll also request financial statements of the business. Okay. Collateral is required for these loans for any that are over $25,000. Lack of collateral won't disqualify an applicant, but they will take a pledge of any collateral that's going to be available. That can include collateral on a car. They really prefer collateral in real estate. And often what they'll do is a blanket UCC filing. Though the SBA is fairly good with subordinating in the event of a refinance. Okay, where to apply? I have the website posted right now. The website this morning and yesterday was down for maintenance, but it is a fairly easy to navigate site. It is slow right now because of the amount of traffic it's receiving. They also have a customer service center. I have those numbers up as well. What you need to file. We've gone through the majority of this throughout the presentation, but I wanted to summarize. You'll need a completed application which on the website will walk you through step by step. You'll need your tax information. You'll need your most recent business filings, as well as filling out an authorization for the prior 3 years for both the business and your personal tax returns. This will also look at any other businesses that you own greater than 50% of or are a managing member of. Personal financial statements, schedules of liability, and patience. They are getting an extreme volume of requests right now. The reported processing time is going to be 30 to 45 days. Depending on the volume, I would expect that to take a little longer. So, duplication of benefit provisions. Members of Congress, particularly Representative Graves from Louisiana, has expressed he wants to make sure that these loans are not going to be considered a duplication of benefit due to the low interest rate, 2.75% for a nonprofit organization or 3.75% for a for-profit organization. The loan itself can be considered a benefit and could have adverse effects in applying for additional grants and other forgiveness things. They, in the current CARES bill, if it does pass, they do specifically state that this will not be considered a duplication of benefit and will not interfere with your ability to enjoy other benefits, though nothing is in law yet. So that is one thing to consider when applying. All right. Do we have any questions?
Keith, let me get started. I had someone send me a question just now. How do I know if my business is a small business?
So there is a threshold. Off the top of my head, I believe it's $200 million.
So basically, everybody on the call.
Yeah, if you're, I have no doubt that everybody in the call would be considered a small business. Most businesses that would not be considered a small business are publicly traded.
And we have a lot of people on the call that are on boards of nonprofits. And so they're probably about to be talking in their board meetings, should we apply for one of these SBA loans? As it relates to nonprofits, what should they particularly be concerned about when making that decision?
So nonprofits, what I'm telling everybody right now is getting your application in is not a bad thing, because as I said, there are plenty of applicants and the processing is going to take some time. Nonprofits need to be concerned with where are their usual revenue streams and will they come back, because these loans will need to be paid back. And that's really the largest concern, especially for a nonprofit, is the ability to repay. Some nonprofits depend heavily on donations. Other nonprofits have some sort of service or some good that they're selling to generate money for their cause. So that would make a huge difference if I was sitting on a board.
Okay, we had another question from Mr. Hall. Renette Hall. Are financial statements of all shareholders required, or just the majority shareholder if you apply for an SBA loan, Keith?
Any shareholder who holds 20% or greater is going to be required. If you have, let's say you have, and that's going to be your general rule, right? There are exceptions to this. Let's say you have 10 owners in a business, and they each own 10%. Well, they're going to require everybody's financials at that point because everybody is a stakeholder. But the general rule is going to be 20% or greater.
And a nonprofit individual asks, what counts as collateral for a nonprofit? How do they deal with collateralizing the loan for an NPO?
Sure. So a nonprofit organization can have assets. Nonprofit organizations could own a building, they could own vehicles, and that will all be considered in looking at collateral, right? So any either outright owned assets or any assets that are not highly leveraged.
But let's say that this nonprofit doesn't own any assets. Is that going to be a big strike against the nonprofit's ability to get a loan?
Yes, not having any assets is going to hurt, though. Nonprofits are a little different for general rules.
But most nonprofits have an endowment or some kind of investment account, right? So that could count as an asset as well, right?
Correct. Even those are going to be assets. You know, we have to remember that we have assets in receivables. We have assets in potential pledges, depending on how the pledges are made. So we do have some intangible assets that we could have collateral in.
And when you talk about filing a blanket UCC, you're talking about filing something in the local mortgage records that effectively gives the SBA a privilege on all of the movable property that the company owns, right? Like cars and stocks and all kinds of stuff like that.
Correct. And they'll usually take a position on both movable and immovable property. The preference is on real estate.
Okay. We've had a couple of questions come in by chat. Hall again asks, if the business does not issue dividends or the shareholders make no money, are financial statements still required? I think the answer to that is yes,
yeah.
right? Right,
yes.
Keith? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think no matter what, you're going to have to submit, if it's more than 20%, you're going to have to submit those financial statements.
Correct.
Although now if you're not making any money, now might be a good time to convert to a nonprofit, right? Any other questions from the group? You can either chat them and I'll ask them, or you can ask them yourself. Are franchisees available to get this loan? Comes a question, Keith.
Yes, in general.
In general, I mean, we're not guaranteeing that you're going to qualify, but franchisees are not exempt. Right,
correct. Keith? If franchisees are not considered ineligible, you'd have to look at both your franchise agreement to see if there's something in there that bars it, or if there's something that's going to bar the filing against the collateral.
Great. Other question on the chat. If a loan is applied for today and the CARES Act is subsequently passed, will payroll, rent, and utilities still be forgiven? As the CARES Act is currently written, I think the answer to that question is yes as well, right?
Correct. So as the CARES Act is currently written, that is correct, for a few reasons. One, just because of how it's written, but two, you're still, like I said, looking at 30 to 45 days for processing, and I would think it's going to really look closer to 2 months.
Right.
So funding, the CARES Act is likely to pass tomorrow, and so funding will be much more subsequent to the passing.
Okay. More questions to come in through chat, or does somebody want to jump in with a question? You will have to unmute yourself if you want to jump in with a question.
Guys, I'm going to take down the presentation so I can see everybody as I'm speaking.
And we're going to put the presentation online on our website at snw.law shortly after this, including the PowerPoint and a video of this presentation, which will undoubtedly be thrilling viewing for you. But if you have more personal questions that you don't feel comfortable asking in this area, you can get in touch with us via the many different ways that are available online. So I'll ask one more time, any other questions that we want to chat? Here's one. Are there any criteria for expenses to be forgiven?
Yeah,
that's the question.
So this is going to be what's coming out of the CARES Act. As I was saying at the beginning, we're going to have another presentation, hopefully on Monday, assuming it passes tomorrow, to go into detail as far as which expenses will be excluded. And I hate to speak speculatively on that because the odds of it being passed without any changes are slim. But the three major areas to focus on right now are payroll, utilities, and rent.
How about the online application process, Keith? You just went through this. Does it allow for the providing of supplemental financial information?
Yes. So as far as your annual or monthly financials for the business, you can get through the entire application without providing that. That will be a subsequent question that will come up once your application has been processed. And they do request that you respond within 7 days.
Keith, we've had a question about the legislation that passed last week with respect to employment. That's not necessarily what this one's about, but can you comment on that as it relates to unemployment benefits?
Yeah, that again is an area that I'd prefer to hold off until our next seminar on Monday.
Because the CARES Act is going to...
Correct. It's where we have they're calling it unemployment on steroids, which is a federal booster for unemployment and is allowing for inclusion of employees on furlough who are still receiving insurance and a few other areas, including self-employed individuals.
Right. But what passed last week was particularly with respect to paid time off for COVID-19, right?
Correct. And again, our Monday presentation will go through that bill as well. Okay. Essentially, in a nutshell, though, if you have somebody who is having to stay home to take care of their children, and children are defined as son or daughter under the age of 18, the first 2 weeks can go unpaid, but the next 10 are paid with a cap. As far as someone who is ill, who is quarantining themselves, they within the restrictions are going to be given 2 weeks PTO.
Okay, and that's required now by federal law, no matter what your policy manual says.
Correct, and there are some pretty detailed restrictions, which is why I'd prefer to get into it on Monday.
Of course,
because that's another 10 minutes or so to go through.
Sure. Okay, more questions on chat, or just speak up, or hold your peace until Monday when we reconvene the group to talk about the CARES Act. Keith, any final comments?
No, if you're considering applying for an SBA disaster loan, sooner the better, because you are going to get put in a queue, especially if the money is essential. I do believe the CARES Act will be passed tomorrow morning, if not over the weekend. So if you do want to see how those interact before applying, we should know much more by Monday.
And just before we let everybody go, just want to let you know that we will be posting this online. We will be having hopefully a CARES Act presentation on Monday, assuming it's signed by the president and passed by the House. We're also working on a business interruption claims webinar because we want to make sure you have all the information you need about that. And we have some employment law updates that we're going to be posting on our website. So if you don't follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn yet, please search for Sternberg, Naccari White. You can go to snw.law and get our contact information. We are open 24/7, phone, email, text, or smoke signal. Any other comments or anything? Then thank you all for coming, and everybody stay safe. Wash your hands.
Yes. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, everybody.